Hello everyone, it's time for another Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast/vidcast. Joining me tonight are Josho Michael Taylor, and a special guest, Jason Klazmer.
How are you?
Hi guys, today we're talking about the first issue that Josho edited as editor of Ancient Warfare Magazine, Ancient Warfare issue 6/5, which dealt with the Emperor Diocletian and his times. And as before, we've have a nice overview introduction by Michael Taylor. So let's listen to that first, shall we?
In AD 284, the guards of the Emperor Numerian opened his litter to discover a fetid corpse. The emperor had been dead for some weeks, but the murder had been hidden until the stench of decomposition gave it away. Such a scene was all too common in the 50 years following the fall of Rome's last stable dynasty, the Severans, in 235. For a half-century, emperors rose and fell at a dizzying pace as the empire was racked with invasion, secession, political instability, and civil war. The high commanders of the army quietly selected one of their own to ascend to the purple, a career soldier named Diocles, who had risen from modest beginnings. There was little expectation, however, that the new emperor would last more than a few years. Diocles quickly proved that he was made of tougher stuff. One of his first actions was to summon the man accused of killing the previous emperor, the Praetorian prefect Aper, draw his sword, and personally slaughter him before the ranks of assembled soldiers. His next act was to seek out and defeat the emperor in the west, Quirinus, in a sharp civil war. Diocles announced his transformation from Balkan soldier to Roman emperor by Latinizing his Greek name to Diocletianus. But Diocletian's reign soon floundered under a set of bushfire wars along the Danube, coupled with a dangerous rebellion in Britain. The standard 3rd century brew of internal strife and external threat that had ruined so many other imperial reigns. Diocletian, however, answered these challenges in a determined and innovative manner. His most notable solution was the creation of the tetrarchy through the appointment of 3 other imperial colleagues. Diocletian and his chief lieutenant Maximian both held the rank of Augustus, while 2 junior emperors, Constantius and Galerius, held the subordinate rank of Caesar. Maximian and Constantius operated primarily in the west, while Diocletian and Galerius focused their activities in the east. Together, these 4 emperors provided the political and military leadership necessary to deal with a series of invasions and rebellions that afflicted the empire. There was, however, no question that Diocletian was the senior emperor. When Galerius lost a battle to the Persians, Diocletian forced him to run on foot beside his imperial chariot for over a mile, humiliated before a parade of soldiers, and this punishment had its effect. Galerius won subsequent victories in the east. Diocletian also engaged in a set of wholesale administrative and military reforms. He carved up Rome's traditional provinces into smaller and more manageable administrative units, and invested heavily in frontier defenses. He is reported to have dramatically increased the size of the Roman army, although he simply may have restored it to its pre-crisis strength. Not all of Diocletian's reforms were successful. His attempt to regulate runaway inflation through imperial fiat failed miserably. His persecution of the Christians put the religion under great stress, but did not reverse its rise. Perhaps his most tragic failure was his inability to control his own succession. Diocletian took the unprecedented step of abdicating in AD 305, the only Roman emperor to ever do so. His hope was to oversee a smooth transition to a new set of tetrarchs. He was also suffering from health problems and seems to have desired a few years of peace, where he supposedly contented himself in his garden. His new tetrarchy did not last. When Diocletian died of natural causes, Around the year 312, the Roman world had again plunged into bloody civil war.
Okay, after this overview of Diocletian's career, let's try and go back about a century and see how we got to this point where Diocletian thought it was necessary to reform and evolve the administration and army of the Roman Empire. Obviously, we're going to be looking at the crisis of the 3rd century, a little bit about the army before, the army after, nature of the new imperial administration, and of course the nature of the army after the 3rd century crisis. All right, who would be happy to take it away from me and give us an overview of the army as it was in the sort of beginning and middle 3rd century AD?
You don't have to go back a little earlier? Cracks start appearing during Marcus Aurelius, I think, or not? And then it sort of escalates with the murder of Alexander Severus.
We do start to see cracks towards even the 3rd quarter of the 2nd century CE, especially during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, when you suddenly have a confluence of external forces pressing against the empire, specifically the Parthian Empire to the east and the Germanic tribes along the Danube River to the north, particularly the Marcomanni and the Quadi, and simultaneously the appearance of what we refer to as the Antonine Plague, which we don't know a whole lot about, but could have indeed wiped out as much as 10% to even 30% of the population. And this acts essentially as a harbinger for what comes during the following century with increasing pressure ever more on the frontiers, more plague, and then sort of an ever-escalating pattern of usurpation and civil war. And so it's this pattern that sort of that gives us the new army of Diocletian and the tetrarchy, and then eventually the late empire from the early empire.
Just some basic numbers. The army is slowly expanding in the early imperial era, although the last legions added to the list are, of course, the ones by Septimius Severus, the 3 Parthian legions, which brings the total count to, I think, 33. We have a reasonable idea, I think, of the auxiliary forces, but as far as I know, we still sort of fall back to the claim of Tacitus that the auxiliary forces about equal the number of legionary forces, but I'm not sure there's evidence for that balance being the same 2 centuries later, because really Tacitus at that time is talking about 23 AD, I think. Probably there's some signs that emperors are getting worried about the loyalty of their legions, and there's reason to think that, of course. If you think about the situation after the murder of Commodus, the civil war in which Septimius Severus gained power, they are naming legions after themselves to show their the expected allegiance of the legions, and of course you see constant pay rises, which may be a way to both buy allegiance for the soldiers and compensate for inflation, which in itself may be due to the Antonine Plague, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and it seems that another kind of important development that's both political and military is that increasingly around the middle of the 2nd century, emperors feel that they need to personally lead major campaigns, which had not been the case, say, in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, where Augustus spends all of his time mostly in Rome and can entrust other generals to go and tromp around Germany. By the time we get to Marcus Aurelius, it's his either himself up in the Danube frontier region, or his sort of brother, quote unquote, Lucius Verus, personally leading campaigns against the Parthians, and this only escalates as emperors, in part because of political instability, only feel that they can command the big concentrated field armies that are engaging in big offensive operations, and this may be another reason why the tetrarchy becomes a necessary solution, is that if the emperor has to personally lead the big campaigns and there's only one emperor, it's very difficult to have sort of concurrent operations. But if you have 4 emperors, then you can actually have one emperor with one army in multiple places at once.
Yeah, because it's essentially, it seems to be almost jealousy that some troops go, hey, the emperor is, he's over there in the east constantly. But we're fighting to uphold the empire on the Balkans. Let's look at our governor. Maybe he can be an emperor. Right? That's essentially what you're referring to, sort of a fear to compensate for that problem.
Yeah, and even, we see that even before there's severe political instability. Someone, say, like Trajan personally campaigning against the Dacian campaign, and some of it just has to do with the emperors always have this kind of political fiction that they're at heart generals and commanders, and their job is to defend the empire. And as the empire comes under more and more strain, there's more pressure for them to actually live that. What in some more peaceful periods could be a real just kind of fiction. And that also means that the emperor's political legitimacy is staked with the emperor actually being an active campaigner. And that, of course, has some risks. When the emperor's out on campaign, he's not necessarily running the empire. It's a lot easier when there's 4 emperors.
Can we say anything? What might have caused these the structure of the legions? Because I guess we have to go to sort of get into an idea of what the army looks like after the 3rd century crisis. There's been 50 years of war. Legions get split up and constantly move all over the empire, fighting a variety of civil wars as well as external enemies. How do we get from situation several dozen legions to maybe twice as many legions 50 years later?
Well, as you say, to start off with, you have a pattern where legions are being divvied up and moved around piecemeal. And it's sort of important to remember that this goes back, even before Marcus Aurelius, this goes back as far as the reign of Trajan, who leads his grand campaigns against first the Dacians and then the Parthians in the east. And to do this, he pulls these small legionary detachments, the vexellationes, from legions all across the frontier, from as far away as Germany for his Dacian campaign and as far away as the Danube for his Parthian campaign. And then over the course of the late 2nd century through the 3rd century, you see an escalation of this pattern where not only are emperors requiring more troops to lead major aggressive campaigns against external enemies, but are in fact requiring as many troops as they can possibly get to face off against external enemies who are coming into the empire, and perhaps even more importantly, against other Roman commanders who are usurping the throne from them, with whom they can't really take any chances. So you have on the one hand the pattern where the vexellationes are being taken ever increasingly, ever more aggressively, and ever more dangerously, so that you see the frontiers basically becoming ever more weak. But then on the other hand, you have, as you alluded to, the kind of losses that you'll see over the course of 50 years of warfare. But then one should also remember the Antonine Plague initially, and then the Cyprian Plague in the 250s through the 270s, which probably also affected the army to a significant degree, which leaves you, by the time you get to the reign of Diocletian and the tetrarchs, Roman legions, which were supposed to be, at least by paper strength, 5,000, 6,000, but are now probably possibly 1,000, 2,000, maybe 3,000. And Diocletian, at least it seems according to the evidence that we have, rather than putting all of these guys up back to their paper strength, instead tries to use a more flexible structure whereby you have more legions with fewer men that can respond to smaller threats more effectively than just peeling off a bunch of men and throwing them against somebody somewhere.
And what can we say about the auxiliaries, who used to be such a fixture on the frontiers as well? Of course, we have this the Constitutio Antoniniana, whereby Caracalla gives basically everybody the citizenship, removing in one stroke the motivation for a lot of soldiers or prospective soldiers to become auxiliaries. what happens to them? Do we have some idea what the auxiliaries were like in the just before the 3rd century crisis and when they came out of it?
I mean, I don't have a great answer for necessarily traditional auxiliary units, although some of them do kind of continue to maintain their lineage. I would say that probably before, by the time we get to the Severan dynasty, many auxiliary units are probably very difficult to distinguish from a Roman unit if you just sort of looked at them. The sort of propaganda on Trajan's column, which makes very clear distinctions aside, both Roman units kind of go native out on the frontier, and then auxiliary units Romanize very quickly. Many of them are increasing themselves, 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation Roman citizens, until, of course, the Antonine Constitution does make this completely irrelevant beyond simply, again, some of the unit lineages are maintained. Maybe the big development with the end of the auxiliary legionary distinction is that the Romans are still, as a result of the crisis, as a result of the ongoing manpower problems, are therefore recruiting not just from provincial non-citizens, but are recruiting from external non-citizens, in particular people like the Franks and eventually the Goths. This is certainly already going on, particularly if you're a pretender. You quickly, I believe one of the articles about the battles in Britain talk about some of the pretenders recruiting big armies of Franks, and that's kind of going to be the future, that instead of auxiliaries making up, say, maybe half the army, we're now looking at foreign forces, foreign sort of recruits making up maybe not half, but a very, very large proportion of the army, and getting bigger as the 4th century goes on.
What do we know of the numbers of the Roman army around this era?
Like all things, it's incredibly problematic. We have one source for the size of the army of Diocletian. It's a 6th century Byzantine bureaucrat named John Litus, and he suggests that in Diocletian's time, and he doesn't say when in Diocletian's reign, but at some point, the army has a strength of 389,000 soldiers. And again, we don't know if that's paper strength or the actual sort of physical number of bodies in the forces. It should be said that actually would not be much bigger than the army of Septimus Severus. In fact, it probably would be a little smaller than the army of Septimus Severus. So, if anything, if we're to believe that Diocletian actually obtained those numbers, he probably simply was bringing the army back up to strength. But then again, it also depends how much we want to trust John Litus and his number. We don't know where he got it.
Yeah, but I believe it's not a round number. It's aren't his numbers incredibly precise?
Yeah, I think I rounded it up for him anyway. I'd have to check what it is exactly, but no one knows where he got this incredibly precise number. Yeah. Again, is this a kind of ideal paper strength or authorized strength for units? We probably would suspect that a lot of units were extremely under strength, but it's again, it's hard to know what to make of that number. We have another historian who suggests that in Constantine's time, things are the army has 600,000 soldiers, or I think 581,000. Again, another very precise figure. And again, we're not sure, is that supposed to be the increase under Diocletian, Constantine's increase, or is it a totally bogus number that we should ignore? It's very difficult to tell.
It would have been an explosion, though, in troop strength, really.
Yeah, and one wonders if the government at the time actually had the resources in terms of money and grain and just general resources to actually maintain such a big force. So I don't know, Jason. I know you've. That's my skepticism, but at the same time, there is evidence that there's attempts to increase the size of the army.
I mean, it's my skepticism too. People have made the argument that not only has Diocletian increased the number of legions that are under arms in the late Empire, but in fact that they are, at least for a while in the 4th century, maintaining the early imperial paper strength of a legion, somewhere around 5,000, 6,000 men, which would give you something around the number that was just cited for Constantine, 500, 600,000. Again, the problem here is because we have so little evidence for specific numbers, for specific amounts of money that the government has at its disposal for supply and demand and all of this stuff. But I, too, would wonder if the government did actually have the ability to enlist, train, supply, feed, and then help to retire all of these guys. I would probably think that a number closer to the early imperial army, maybe somewhat larger than that, but would be more realistic. But that should not be to minimize Diocletian's accomplishment here of not only being able to piece the army back together, but in fact being able to put it at a pre-crisis standing after the 50 years that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I would say simply to achieve a roughly 390,000 or 400,000 strength would be an incredible achievement if he did indeed was able to do this.
But of course, we have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it should be noted, talking about sort of the resources that the emperors have at their disposal. One of the big problems, one of many big problems, is that emperors have traditionally been able to draw huge amounts of silver from the mines in the Balkans and the mines in Spain. And it seems that at this point the silver is not just running low, but is running dry. And there's been debasement issues with Roman coinage for quite some time. But at this point, there just isn't the metal to actually mint the kinds of coins necessary to keep the level of coinage necessary in the economy. So the coins are extremely debased. The soldiers are getting paid basically with lead with a little silver sheen. And this may be one of the reasons why, you see some attempts, like, say, Aurelian to reform the coinage, which seem to fail miserably. And this may be why Diocletian issues one of his most famous sort of civil pronouncements, which is the price edict. He's actually attempting to make sure that his soldiers' pay goes further by limiting the amount that you could charge a soldier for, a bushel of wheat or transport or anything else that they would be buying with their pay.
And in fact, it does say in the introduction to the price edict that the current economic strain that the empire is facing is caused by specifically the greed of the merchants, who are preying upon the noble soldiers of the Commonwealth who are there to defend them. So this does sort of further that point that this is very specifically something that's designed perhaps not to regain economic stability per se, but he's specifically, at least outwardly, trying to appeal to the soldiers under his command at this point.
Because at this point, it's impossible to actually pay them more, which is the traditional imperial response to inflation or the debasement of the coinage. Is, well, the coins are worth less, but we've added another. We've raised them. This is what the Severans do. At this point, that's ceased to be a feasible option. So if you can't pay them more, you can issue a fiat that simply says, well, whatever we're paying them now is worth a lot more. It doesn't seem to work very well, but it's an attempt to deal with the economic problems that the empire is facing.
Well, there's a third suggested attempt, anyway, is also to pay soldiers in kind.
I guess that's where it's hard to tell what's the actual reform of any particular emperor, but it does seem that some kind of a nona in-kind system of taxation is very prevalent at this point. Maybe even started around the 100s AD, but certainly a lot of what people are paying in taxes, particularly people in a military zone, maybe actually be direct payments in terms of clothing and grain and supplies to the military.
Just to come back to the question about the numbers, is it possible that, especially this increase, if we have to assume that both numbers are correct, that there is, because we see this change in structure of the army, the units and types of units get completely different names. We just don't have the simple legionary, auxiliary, for a couple forms, and maybe fleet soldiers, but you have the the Palatinate auxilia, you have the Limitanae, the border soldiers, literally translated anyway. Is it possible that we see maybe an increase in militia-esque troops who are not normally or constantly soldiers, but maybe called up to serve if there's an emergency and are counted in the bigger number?
Well, on one hand, there's huge controversy over just what the Limitanae were. The sort of standard description is a frontier militia or second-rate soldiers that are stationed as kind of a grandiose border patrol. There's been some pushback against that, suggesting that's the name of a perfectly good unit that happens to be on the frontier, on the limes, so they're called Limitanae. One gets the sense, however, that the striking power of the later empire is a lot less. And here I may be channeling Ramsay MacMullen, who has a very grim view of the late Roman army. But it does seem that someone like Trajan can mass 100,000 soldiers on the Danube and invade across pretty easily. And in the late period, that doesn't seem to be something that emperors are able to do, at least that level of troop strength. So I actually think there probably is some truth to the kind of traditional notion that there were increasingly these kind of offensively minded field armies of very good, high-quality, well-trained, well-disciplined, well-organized troops, and then a large number of garrison troops on the frontiers, whatever their title or status, who probably went to seed a bit and could not be counted on, say, to quickly transfer across the empire to deal with the Parthians, the way that traditional legions of the early and high empire could be counted on to do. But again, I am kind of sticking to a maybe somewhat traditionalist and some would say outdated view.
Maybe Jason can give the more modern view.
The more modern view would be one that, at least for the period under the tetrarchy and at least the first half of the fourth century, if not later, the Limitanae are perhaps not exactly on the exact same level as the Comitatensian field armies. Maybe they're not paid as much. At least if you're going by the Notitia Dignitatum, they seem to be subordinated according to a hierarchy to the field armies, but that they could hold their own and that they were a significant force. And perhaps later in the Western Empire, as you get into the 5th century, when the administration, the bureaucracy, and political control essentially starts to contract ever closer to Italy, and they're less able to exert themselves in the provinces, that the Limitanae become more like this static militia with very regional concerns and limited capabilities. But I do think that there is I personally at least, I do think that there is something to the idea that you have a limited striking capability with the field armies and that the Limitanae are there to sort of hold down the fort, because this jives very, very well with the kinds of patterns in international relations that we see in the Roman Empire during this period. Trajan can pull all of these guys from all over the empire to go fight the Dacians and go fight the Parthians, because it doesn't seem as though, at least in the first century and the 2nd century, or the first half of the 2nd century at least, that there are any major external concerns on those frontiers from which he is taking troops. Whereas when you get into the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, there's only so many men that you can pull off of the frontier before you begin to endanger that frontier zone against whoever's standing on the other side of it.
Maybe we could switch a little bit to the more literal look of the army. It's obvious. I mean, if you just look at the cover of this issue, these guys don't look anymore like the segmentada-clad soldier of the 1st and 2nd century AD, even if we might suggest that that's a stereotype. What can we say about the equipment and the various fashions have been explained actually in this issue, but the equipment of the soldiers, and perhaps we have some ideas of why this changed.
The equipment appears to have been slightly barbarized to sort of exaggerate the issue slightly. The adoption of long Germanic or Celtic swords and stuff like that.
Which suggests a change in tactics, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where it's again, we just don't have a lot of great sources, at least for Diocletian. At least what we get from Ammianus is that it seems that the primary sort of new infantry tactic is a shield wall, a very phalangeal, almost a throwback to the old days of the hoplite phalanx, closely locked shields, and then this shield wall is a basis for maneuver by cavalry, armed troops, missile troops. And we do see a number of depictions of shield walls on the art of the period, frescoes from Dura Europa. On the Arch of Galerius and Constantine, you actually see Roman soldiers with new rounded shields, which again are kind of better for making a shield wall because you have the edge of your round shield to lock with the guy next to you. We do see them forming again a kind of phalangeal type unit, and then with their spears overhead. So you might say that's a bit of a not necessarily a complete throwback, but it does seem that that's the predominant infantry tactic, which might differ at least from the kind of infantry tactics we read about in Polybius or Caesar, which do imply a somewhat at times more fluid infantry fighting style. But at the same time, we also do see this this kind of Germano-Celtic sword is adopted. We see different new types of missiles. I think the magazine had a feature on the plumbata, so new emphasis on throwing darts, and even some Frankish axe here or there. So it does seem that soldiers encountering new types of peoples with different types of weapons are adopting them freely, which of course is something Romans have been doing since there were Romans. But definitely they, I might even dare say that the army of the late Roman Empire definitely looks less than what we think of as classically Roman, and you might even confuse them for something that's kind of medieval.
The shield wall, by the way, it isn't necessarily a throwback to the phalanx fighting, of course, because you have shield walls already in Homer. When they defend bodies that have fallen on the ground, you get people standing with shields in front of them. And it's a very common Germanic tactic also in later times. The Anglo-Saxons, I think, use shield walls, and you also see them with the Vikings. So it's probably also something that may have been a Teutonic influence of some sort.
Almost all infantry soldiers equipped with shields at some times locked together. I mean, soldiers in Polybius's time do this, and you could say it's not necessarily totally revolutionary. One does wonder that the introduction of a new round shield, which we have evidence from both the statuary and also from the Notitia Dignitatem, has all these beautiful, if not necessarily historical, shield emblems. Again, that may be something to kind of facilitate a tactic of having at least the first rank form a shield wall, and then allowing maybe having archers or missile troops in the back. And again, this is mostly based on the Ammianus's description of Strasbourg, so several many decades after Diocletian. And it does seem that there is a renewed emphasis also on heavy cavalry, that the Romans are adopting and copying and using Persian-style heavy cavalry, and that maybe the core of these field armies is a effective heavy cavalry cadre, which again is an emphasis that you don't necessarily see as much in the previous periods.
Now that might have been because of their encounters with the Sassanids, of course, with the cataphracts and everything.
I would presume in part, although I think you see a lot of them in the West as well. Some of it may also be that, again, that as Jason was mentioning, you have this problem of having to move from one place to another very quickly to deal with different kind of bushfire threats, and in some ways a heavy cavalry unit, while it has some significant logistical requirements, can move, say, from spot to spot to spot to help stop out different bushfires, whether it's a problem on the frontier or a new pretender popping up somewhere within the empire.
What else can we add about this fascinating but sometimes difficult to reconstruct period?
Well, actually, so talking about the appearance of the army, we've dealt with issues of their offensive capabilities, the new swords. Well, we talked about the shields. That's not exactly offensive. But also other forms of personal equipment. You see significant changes also going back and looking at the cover, specifically in terms of the helmets that they're wearing, the armor that they're wearing, and the kinds of debates that those things have attracted in the scholarship. This idea they're no longer wearing, as you said, lorica segmentata, the kind of thing that you see if you're watching Gladiator. They're wearing chainmail. What's the reason for this? Is this a reflection of new tactics? Is this a reflection of the state's inability to continue to produce and repair lorica segmentata, whereas lorica hamata, the chainmail itself, is easier to produce, cheaper to produce? The new forms of helmets, which seem to be possibly of a Germanic origin, possibly also of a Persian origin. This all sort of feeds into these sorts of questions that we have, and as Michael always reminds us, and as our students are always sick of hearing from us, we just don't have enough evidence to always tell us exactly why these things happen.
Is there anything we should get to before we maybe wrap this up?
Maybe a brief bit on the end of the tetrarchy? Sort of tied up? Or...
Tie it back in? All right.
Yeah.
So Diocletian manages something that had not been possible, or at least we had not seen over the previous half a century, and in fact even longer than a half century. The fact that you have an emperor who takes power, as all of the other emperors during the 3rd century had, basically at the point of a sword. He was a usurper. The fact that we consider him to be a legitimate emperor simply because, he won. But he manages not only to take power and to hold power for just a little while, he holds power for a significant period of time, in fact over 20 years, which is unmatched since the reign of Septimius Severus, who died in 211. Actually, he's not even quite 20 years, is he? But in any case,
No.
And it seems as though by the force of his personality, by his own charisma, he's able to not only just hold power, but in fact to reform how the Romans go about keeping their empire. All of the reforms that you see in the military, in the economy, the bureaucracy and civil administration, so on and so forth, and especially we see at the very top of the social pyramid the actual creation of the tetrarchy, where you have the 4 emperors ruling all at the same time. And it seems as though when you get to the end of 305, possibly Diocletian's suffering from some health issues, we don't know exactly what, but at the very least it seems as though he wants to kickstart this new program of his. You have him and Maximian as the senior Augusti, you have the 2 subordinate Caesars in Galerius and Constantius, and it seems as though his idea is, while I am still alive and able to see what happens, I would like to have the 2 senior Augusti step down, get the 2 Caesars to step up, install their own new Caesars, and then basically move this program forward. It had been working in a way that the imperial administration hadn't been during the 3rd century crisis, and he wanted to move it forward. But based upon what occurs next, after 305, after he and Maximian step down, without him there with his power and his charisma to actually control or at least oversee the activities of the subordinate emperors, the system begins to fall apart. And this happens almost immediately with the accession of Constantine. This is the son of Constantius, who had been the Caesar in the West, then the Augustus in the West. When he dies in the year 306, what happens instead of what was supposed to happen, being that his own Caesar, a man named Severus, would step up to be the Augustus and then name his own Caesar. The soldiers in Britain name Constantius' son Constantine to be the new Augustus in the West, not the Caesar even, but the Augustus, which breaks the type of tetrarchic pattern that Diocletian had in mind. And this seems to have basically released the floodgates of the possibility that, okay, well, you know what? I wasn't actually in the imperial running, but because I have some power, I have some troops behind me, because I'm related to one of the tetrarchs, I can try and take power as well. And this is what you see with Maxentius in Italy, and basically the entire thing unravels. You have Galerius trying to step in and play the Diocletian position, but it doesn't seem like he manages as well as his predecessor did.
And then Constantius' War is probably the topic for another issue. For now, I'd like to thank Michael, Josho, and especially Jason for joining me tonight. I guess we'll try and talk again soon.